really learning how to work with your vagus nerve and work with your breath, for me has become the actual practice of rebuilding trust with myself and others.
All right, all right. Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode Behind Beliefs, Behaviors in the Brain. I am your host, and I am super excited to have, I have to say, this sister right here. Before I formally introduce who she is, I met her. I think we've been connected. I've been following her maybe on the LinkedIn space for a while, but then she came into a leadership collective and did a session with us on trust. And man, when I tell you, I was like starry eyed, like she speaks my language, because you all know, if you listen to this podcast, that I often talk about trust and communication. I talk about trauma and things of that nature. And so when I dove deep down the rabbit hole into her organization, the Center for Trust and Transformation, that I was like, I fell in love. And then I met her personally. And that in of itself really confirmed everything I already knew to be true, that we were connected. We were soul sisters. And so I am super excited. I immediately asked her, I was like, can you please, please, please come on the podcast? And she was like, yes. So I'm happy to have on this podcast today, Amber Banks. She is the CEO and founder of the Center for Trust and Transformation, and her zone of genius is trust and social justice. And we are going to be having a wonderful conversation today around trust and trauma, because we don't talk about it enough. So let me be the first to welcome you, Amber, to the podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. How are you today?
Hi, Maisha. Thank you so much for having me on. It is a true pleasure. As you said, we were kindred spirits from the beginning. As soon as I learned about your work and understood where your zone of genius is, I also felt just so excited to learn alongside of you and to be a part of this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I really love for our audience to get to know our guests a little bit more deeply. And so I would love if you shared a little bit about your journey, how you came to found the Center for Trust and Transformation, and just who you are. Who are you, Amber?
Thank you, Maisha. Or should I call you Dr. Claiborne?
You can call
What's
me
your
Maisha.
Maisha, perfect. I am Dr. Amber Banks. My people are from Kentucky, Nebraska, Seattle, California, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee, on the unceded lands of the Shawnee, Yuchi, and Cherokee people. And my journey started in Los Angeles. I am Black biracial. My dad is Black and my mom is white. And I grew up moving between two different worlds in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, which was a very interesting education. And so I learned early on that people trusting each other wasn't a given, and that a lot of times our relationships are charged with broader social dynamics that we may or may not be aware of that are impacting our relationships. And I took that education into education, and I became a special education teacher working primarily with children with autism. And I did a lot of social skills work and wrote curriculum and did a lot of project-based learning and community-based learning with young people with autism, and learned a lot. I always say that my students taught me just as much as I taught them. And I learned a lot about relationships through them, about nonverbal communication, about how when we are curious about each other, we can build connection across seemingly vast divides. And so I would say my experience in education really was the foundation for the work on trust. So I went to
Mm.
graduate school at the University of Washington, and I have a PhD in education, leadership, policy, and organizations. And when I sat back and thought about what my contribution to the field would be, it really came down to trust.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know how we build trust across difference, across
Mhm.
sectors,
Mhm.
and within coalitions. And so I really looked at trust networks in the context of an education justice coalition that had come together to improve education in South Seattle.
Yeah.
And that work is what led me to the Center for Trust and Transformation. We can get more into it, but I think ever since that spark, I've been evolving within the work around trust. And the basic tenet of the work of the Center for Trust and Transformation and
Mhm.
why I created the organization in the first place is
Mhm.
because we are in need of a paradigm shift in our work around trust, in our understanding of trust. Because right now, in our what I call our popular consciousness, we define trust according to a set of characteristics: reliability, competence, benevolence, these, really important characteristics that shape
Mhm.
our relationships. But what we're missing is the knowledge and practice of recognizing how identity, power, context, and value shape our definitions of trust. So, what competence looks like to one person may look different to another person in a different culture or in a different context or with a different identity. And I think this is a lot of why we end up talking past each other, is
Mhm.
because we're not necessarily acknowledging this basic fact that we are coming to relationships
Yeah.
with different definitions and different
Mhm.
expectations without aligning on what that means for each of us.
Yes. I'm trying to find that, and you're going to tell me because if I missed it, the name of the article that we read, because I've read so many of your articles. I'm like, which one did we read? One of the things that stood out for me was your story around as you were looking at the models for trust, that you did not see yourself in those models for trust. And when I read that part of that piece, you were talking about the trust compass, which you created. When I read that piece, it hit so much. I was like, you know what? For me, it connected on something that was missing. And so, what I appreciate so much is then how that led you to develop this trust compass. It got me to thinking about all of the things that we don't think about that build trust, the unsaid things that build trust or that take away trust, and the underpinnings that trauma contribute to that. As you talk about the different things that move into trust, I often think about the barriers to that, and the way we communicate with each other, not taking into account the wounds that people already come with, and how the way we interact can poke those wounds, can open those wounds, can scrape those wounds. And then the model that you've built then has us look at what are the things that play into that as well.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. When I was doing my dissertation work, which was now 15 years ago, it's hard to imagine, I came across the work of Dr. Shayla Noonally, who was in North Carolina at the time, I believe. But she wrote a book called Trust in Black and White, where she looked at large scale, I think it was the General Social Survey. So she looked at large scale data around trust through the lens of white respondents and Black respondents. And one of the terms that she coined that really shaped my thinking was this term racialized trust.
Mm.
And she named how the legacy of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and racism in this country have shaped Black Americans' perceptions of trust
That's right.
and experiences, or lack thereof, of safety in relationships.
Mhm.
And so that work was really important because up until that point, it was very difficult to find people who wrote about trust in the
Mhm.
United States through a cultural and racial lens in a
Mhm.
way that honored different perspectives. It was more
Mhm.
common to find those types of articles internationally
Yeah.
than in the United States. And
Mhm.
so when I talk about the popular consciousness, it's almost like it's in the water, right? That it's we have internalized
Mhm.
these definitions of trust
Mhm.
as doctrine, but we aren't reflected in them,
Right.
because if we were, then we would understand how racialized trust or gendered trust or power and trust
Mhm.
shape our experiences.
That's right.
And so I did create a tool called the Trust Compass that
Mhm.
breaks down this shift from characteristic based trust
Mhm.
to a trust that really understands our individual experience and
Yeah.
perspectives
Yeah.
first and foremost.
Mhm.
But I think as it relates to trauma, this is a really interesting area that we absolutely don't talk about enough. So I'm really excited to hear what you're learning as well, Maisha, because when it comes to trauma, I just finished rereading The Body Keeps the Score,
Mhm.
and our bodies physiologically are stuck in a past moment.
That's right.
And so when we're trying to build a relationship in the present moment, and that trauma is reenacting itself in our nervous systems,
Mhm.
it makes it almost impossible to build that connection in a sustainable way. I think we can in many cases, but
Mhm.
it's difficult to sustain. And the hard part is, I'll often say we can never trust anyone more than we trust ourselves. But when it comes to trauma, and I can only really speak from my own experiences, I am not a veteran. I have not been a victim of physical violence, right? Like, I just want to temper my own experience of trauma. But I know that if it's something that I haven't processed yet, then I can't share that part of myself with other people,
Mhm.
no matter how hard I try.
Yeah.
And I wonder how often that's happening
Mhm.
because of the intergenerational traumas we've inherited and the current traumas we're experiencing.
I really appreciate you lifting that up. I think one of the things that sometimes gets overlooked is sort of this expanded paradigm of trauma, because I think sometimes we overlook what our body is telling us in service of the present moment, and forcing ourselves, like, why I should trust this person, I should be able to trust even when our body is telling us something different. And so oftentimes we think about trauma very narrowly. We think about it in that there has to have been some major sentinel event that has happened in order for us to have survived or be impacted in a way, that trauma to live in our bodies. But we know that trauma can be direct or it can be indirect. Trauma can be as a result of one event or multiple small events or environments. Toxic environments over time create a hypervigilance that then, like, lands in the body as trauma. And so we want to recognize that when it comes to trust, if we're in a constant environment, a constant toxic environment, it's like death by a thousand paper cuts. Like, it leaves these little micro scars that actually don't feel so micro, by the way. They build and they build and they build until one day you're wondering why you're feeling so hypervigilant, why you're in an organization and an environment where you feel like you're looking over your shoulder. It's because of these sort of subtle acts of exclusion, or subtle acts of whatever those acts might be, that are building, like subtle acts of abuse, subtle acts of manipulation, we could go on and on about what those are. Subtle gaslighting, all of those things, right? Subtle invalidation, all of those things. They build and they impact the way we see things, and the way we see our environment, and the way we trust inside of that environment. And so I think it's important for when people are thinking about this idea, especially organizations and leaders who are saying, well, how do we build trust? How do we build trust in our organizations? To consider the environment as a ground, and how they're creating the environment as sort of an input for whether they're building or whether they're threatening or destroying that trust. And I think that goes for communities and goes for nations. And then, of course, we chunk it down into individual interactions because who makes up all of these big organizations but we, the people.
That's right. Thank you for naming the repeated acts of trauma that happen
Mhm.
all the time.
Mhm.
It's really affirming to hear you name that, because how many times have we been in an organization or been in a situation where we're like, did anybody else see that? Did anybody else hear that? Wait,
Is it just me?
right? And I think in many ways we have been conditioned, and I will speak for myself as a Black biracial woman of color, to question myself,
Mhm.
right?
That's
And to
right.
question or to dismiss my trauma as I just did it a few minutes ago. I
Mhm.
dismissed my trauma as
Mhm.
not as important
Yeah.
as maybe someone else's, which,
Yeah.
I really want I know that there is a lot of harm happening in the world. So
Mhm.
it's not meant to be like the trauma Olympics,
Of
but
course.
I think we are conditioned in many ways to minimize it.
That's right.
And that is probably wreaking havoc on our relationships to some extent.
Yeah. And it brings it right back to around to what you said at the very beginning. Is like the most important trust is trusting ourselves, right? Because when we can't trust our own experiences in our own body, when we are socialized to ignore our bodies and to ignore the intuitive lived experience that we're having, then we're more likely to lean into what other people are telling us. And that only reinforces our experience of trauma. Like there's a trauma just in not trusting oneself.
That's the truth. There's a disconnection for sure. I
Mhm.
would say for me, my journey back to myself, to truly trusting myself, has been through this work. And it
Mhm.
really, I had two children a few years apart.
Mhm.
And in 2020, right before the pandemic hit, they were 3 and no, 2 and 5. So,
Mhm.
I was just in the part of parenting
Mhm.
where starting to pick my head up, like we're
Mhm.
almost out of diapers. So there's a little
Mhm.
bit of a blur before that.
Right.
And, I was in the grind, going to the doing the things,
Mhm.
working all the time. And a
Mhm.
friend tipped me off to an energy healer.
Mhm.
And she said, I think you'd really enjoy this. And that really sparked a lot of my healing work,
That's awesome.
to really take stock and realize that I had become very disconnected from myself and I
Mhm.
was just going through the motions.
Mhm.
And it took years to really turn over all the stones. I went through a healing centered coaching program. I got to give a plug to Leslie Avant Brown and Blooming Willow Coaching, because they, from there, pulled all the layers back, right? I
Yes.
couldn't be a healing centered coach if I hadn't done the healing myself.
Yeah.
And I think through that journey, I just, it's every day relearning to listen to my body and remembering to trust my instincts.
That's
It's
right.
lifelong work for all of us.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of liberation in it.
Yeah. It's so interesting again, as I listen to you share that, it takes me back to, again, some of the work that I've read of yours, where one of the ways that we connect is in that acknowledgement that we all have to do the work, the internal work. And I think that's a lot of what organizations miss is that, yes, we have to put policies in place, we have to put procedures in place. But if we don't do the internal work of peeling back the layers of trusting ourselves, then we can't demonstrate trust for others. Because if we don't trust others, then they won't trust us. Like there's that sort of what is that called? There's a word that I'm trying to pull. I think my menopause brain is kicking in the moment. That irony, in a sense, where in order to one of the ways, not all the ways, but one of the ways to get trust is to give it, right? To be vulnerable, because when like that's what happens when we're giving trust, we're being vulnerable. But coming back to the organizational work is that a lot of I think that's a lot of the work that organizations miss, is that each person in the organization, leaders in the organization, but also frontline service people in the organization have to do that work. Because if we only focus on leadership doing the work, but then the people who are actually on the ground running the organization of, and in the case of my industry, physicians and staff and nurses and front desk people and triage people and radiology people, they're like on the ground doing the work directly with patients. If they can't cultivate that trust amongst each other, with themselves, then they can't transmit it to patients. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that maps over to whatever industry, whatever community there is that we have to start internally.
100%. I actually think, despite all of the chaos and harm that's happening right now, which I do not want to minimize it because it is not normal and not okay. But I think there's an opportunity, because in the work that I do around supporting organizations and leaders to build and repair trust, I am seeing a readiness that I have not seen for the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people, you know, I always, even though our definitions of trust up until recently were shaped by predominantly white men, I always pay homage to their work, because they did do important work to
Mhm.
put trust on the table at a
That's right.
time when it wasn't really being talked about.
Mhm.
But now I think we're in another chapter where we get to pick up the baton and really name that, with all the strategy and all the policies and all
Mhm.
the handbooks,
Mhm.
that's all really important. But if
Mhm.
we don't have the relational infrastructure to guide our work towards
Mhm.
the impact that we want to have,
Mhm.
none of it matters. And
Mhm.
I think that there's an awakening to
Mhm.
this that
Mhm.
is helping people be more willing to engage in this work, because it's so hard and
Yeah.
so vulnerable. But I
Yeah.
think people are really eager to figure it out.
Yes. No, I had this vision while you were talking about of a relay race, right? And and like, it doesn't matter who's the first leg, who's second leg, who's the third leg, and who's the fourth leg. But I can see us like as we're like Team USA, those four amazing Black women that are passing the baton. And you were running, and I was like with my hand out, ready for the baton, because that's how I see our work is so complementary and connected. I do very much appreciate, what you talked about in terms of paying homage to those who brought trust to the table. And I too am seeing a lean in, particularly because I do the work of trauma-informed communication, but it starts with touching on these concepts and these aspects of trauma and trust and psychological safety and building emotional intelligence, right? Because I think emotional intelligence is a very critical part of building trust, because we have to be able to manage ourselves. First of all, be aware of what's going on in there in our body, like reconnect, as you talked about. We can be very distracted. I can speak for myself too, like just socialize to be all up here and not in my body. And so when you talked about being connected to an energy healer, like that is such a wonderful embodiment space to be in, because we reconnect with our bodies and reconnect the trust in our bodies, reconnect even the communication in our bodies. Coming back a little bit to trauma, I think one of the things that also doesn't get recognized is that generational piece, that generational and historical trauma that impacts our ability to trust. We see it in healthcare, we see it in organizations, we see it in education, we see it in the therapeutic psychology settings, mental health settings, just all over the place. And so there's that generational component, and then there's the vicarious component of trauma. So even if we haven't directly experienced it, we are witnessing it every day, especially with social media and our access to the information that's going on around the world. And so I think that given that, that needs to be acknowledged. And we, as we do the internal work, as we reconnect in our bodies, as we experience these things, we have to peel back the layers on what are all the elements that we're exposed to so that we can begin the healing process. And we can also begin to manage the dose of the vicarious stuff, because that's the place where we can control. We may not be able to control what happened in the past. We can just manage and heal, do the healing work. But we can control how much we expose ourselves on media, social media. We can even control, although some might argue about this with me, in our jobs. We can control, we have some bit of control in our organizations of how we navigate that, even to the point of sometimes leaving those spaces, right? And so I just really coming back to what you said about lifting up, where there's policies and procedures, we must connect into the relational component of this work.
Yes, Maisha, you are speaking my language. I love it. There's so many thoughts sparked for me. One that I'll say is I love Prentice Hemphill's What It Takes to Heal and their framework around boundaries. I feel like it's such an important part of the healing work to be able to name one's boundaries and move within them. I think there's a lot of work around boundaries and what it means to create a container for our healing that they talk about. The other thing is you mentioned embodied, and lately I've been, well, I'd say in the last year, been doing a lot more work around embodied trust. And so I've been really doing a lot of deep dives into polyvagal theory and understanding the nervous system. And one of the things I've had to do some rewiring of my nervous system, which was completely fried and wired towards stress and chaos. And so over this last year, have really intentionally tried to understand my nervous system triggers and what parts of my nervous system are preventing me from deeper connections to myself and others. And one of the things that I learned about is the ventral vagal nerve, which goes from our brain, sort of the center of our brain, down to our hearts across the front of our bodies. And so the vagus nerve, we know, is sort of that nerve that helps us reset into a calm state. And so, really learning how to work with your vagus nerve and work with your breath, for me, has become the actual practice of rebuilding trust with myself and others, because without my nervous system online, it was really hard for me to be in those heightened environments and to witness vicarious trauma. My nervous system was just getting hijacked all the time because it was predisposed. And so I just think, if anyone listening, really learning about the ventral vagus nerve and how our nervous system has evolved to be wired for connection.
Yes.
Right? That is our default state, we have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to be able to connect with each other. But these ancient bodies that, for by and large, haven't evolved very much, like from the time when we were living off the land, are living in these chaotic 24/7 technology laden environments. And so for me, it has unlocked a lot of resource to be able to name for my body, okay, this nervous system was not built for this environment. So how do I need to regulate my environment and my body in order to better access a state where I can readily connect? Because I just think a lot of times it's all running haywire and we aren't invited into our agency around it.
Yes. Oh, girl. I love that you brought in polyvagal theory and the brain and the nervous system. I just started reading What It Takes to Heal. So I'm looking forward to getting through that. I'm lifting up this whole piece around boundaries, because that is one thing when I would coach, that was like a main theme, is like how we set boundaries. And in the more facilitated spaces, I talk about boundaries, but I talk about what's the language of setting boundaries in a way that people can hear them. Because, sometimes we want to set those boundaries, but we don't always have the language. And so when we don't have the language, it sometimes can create fear in people to do it because they feel like they're going to say it in the wrong way and they're going to offend people. And so that's a lot of the work that I do around giving people language. But I did this piece around like the nervous system and the brain and understanding our bodies. I think it's so important because again, it leads us back into that our connection into our emotional awareness and our emotional intelligence and what our body is doing so that we can know when it's time to take care of ourselves. If we know the early signals that we're becoming activated, then we can take a step back. We can draw that practice, that breath. If we can hear in our bodies when we're feeling unsafe, then we can draw on our five senses to look around and to reconnect and ground ourselves back in our bodies. And so I think it's just so important for us to learn about. I love this embodied trust piece. I feel like there's like a whole conversation we can have just about that. And so I think it's just so important, again, to come back to listening to our bodies, understanding how our bodies work, because that empowers us to know, even if we don't have the language, to step back and say, you know what, I'm feeling some kind of way, I need to process. And then you could step away, or you could say, this is getting intense. Let us cool down, let us pause, let us breathe, or whatever it is that you need to do in language to let that other person know. Or if you're watching something or you're being exposed to something, to go ahead and titrate that dose down.
Yeah, I love what you just said, Maisha, because I feel like right now the temptation is urgency and
Yeah.
speed. And to be clear, there are a lot of urgent needs that need to be met in our communities.
Mhm.
And I think there also needs to be an invitation to slow down
Yeah.
because we are experiencing a lot of collective trauma right now,
Mhm.
and we're going to burn out.
Mhm.
It's too much. And so I think thinking about the ways and the places where we can slow things down.
Mhm.
I don't know if you've read
Oh, I have not, but I'm writing that down.
4,000 Weeks is by his name is going to come to me while I'm describing it. 4,000 Weeks is the average human lifespan.
Mm.
And it's a book about shifting from a life of urgency. He makes the really good point that, the to-do list is never done, right? It's not like there's some magical state where there is no to-do list. And so if we are going, Oliver Berkman is his name. He's a British man.
Okay. Mm.
So if there's no state where everything is done and everything is perfect, then we might as well live the lives that are most fulfilling and joyful and safe as we define it.
Yeah.
And so I think it really puts things in perspective around, I think, connection, right?
Mhm.
Who and how do we want to be connected? And do we
Mhm.
feel agency to drive that for ourselves?
Mhm.
And I think that's where boundaries come in. In
Yeah.
some cases, we have to have boundaries with family or friends
Mhm.
or other people in our lives. And ultimately, we are all deserving of love and dignity and
Mhm.
connection.
Mhm.
And so, how do we cultivate that for ourselves amidst the many, many traumas that we're all navigating, which I
Mhm.
think then leads to an invitation to tend to each other, to
Yeah.
care for each other. And just to take it full circle, this is what I love about a definition of trust that
Mhm.
rests on curiosity, because it
Mm.
requires questioning and holding space for each
Mhm.
other's truths. So if
Yeah.
Maisha, when we first met, if I would have assumed how you built or repaired trust, they would have closed so many doors
Yeah.
versus opening the doors of how do you think about it and how did you get there and what was that like for you?
Yeah.
Those, it's a definition of trust that builds trust.
Yes.
And that's what I love most about it because I just, there's so much richness in there for us to explore.
Yeah, I love that. I love that curiosity. I often talk about opening the conversation rather than closing the conversation. And that is what that curiosity does. It keeps that conversation open and it does deepen the connection because you learn so much. I often say, one of the reasons I love, love, love podcasting, and especially with guests, is that even if I've known the guest, the person 20 years, I always learn something that I never knew about them. I'm like, what? We've been knowing each other that long and I didn't know, and so I always learn so much about one's personal story and personal lived experience. And then we get to digging into the conversation and it just gets even more rich based on that curiosity. And so, man, I really do feel like we're gonna need a part two or even just another conversation. I need to have you back on the podcast. I don't ask everyone to come back, but I'm definitely wanting you because this is just so rich. I mean, we haven't even touched on, and I'll say this is one of the things I would love for us to actually have a full conversation about is your trust compass. And so we haven't even touched on that yet. We have touched on so many things. Embodied trust. We could have an entire conversation about embodied trust. I feel like I'm creating a series for us. I feel like that's what I've just done here. And I definitely have to get your consent on that one.
I love it. The other one I would add to the list is repair because we can't talk about trust without talking about repair.
We must talk about repair. Absolutely, absolutely. So
Yes.
yes, yes. Man, I mean, I really wish we could just go on and I know you got stuff to do. And so I really appreciate. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna read this book, 4,000 Weeks. I've taken so much from this conversation. And so I really want to ask you just if you had something, because we did cover a lot. If you had something that you wanted our audience to take away today, what would that be for you?
That's a great question. I think the piece that feels most alive is to get curious about the places, spaces, beliefs, and circumstances that are separating us from each other and us from ourselves. I
Mm-hmm.
think asking the question multiple times a day, is this helping me connect with myself or other people? Is a really important. We can't always be in that state. That's just
Yeah,
not how life is.
right.
But I think it's also really easy to get lost in the shifting tides and taking that time to really stop and look at, is this helping me connect? Is this where I want my attention and energy to be?
Mm-hmm.
And I think most importantly, with ourselves,
Yeah.
whether that's a journaling practice or a meditation practice or a walk or playing a game with your kids
Yeah.
or looking at old pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Let's remember ourselves in all of
Mm.
this.
Yeah. I'm going to underline that with your invitation for us to slow down because I think you said something very important is that while there are places where there are urgencies, I think it's important to pull back a little bit to fill our reserves through connection, through grounding, through these energy embodiment practices. And so I just want to underline that, what you said, that invitation to slow down. And I think that allows people to do exactly what you said, just to like connect and find those spaces where you can play. You can play with yeah, you can journal, you can meditate, you could do whatever that is that connects you and fulfills you as you explore these curiosities around trust. Thank you so
That's
much.
right. Joy is an act of resistance.
It really is joy and play and active resistance. And I think, we're starting to see some elements of where in our communities that's coming to, we're starting to get that in these pockets, like, okay, let's grab on to some playfulness and some humor and some joy as that act of resistance. And so
Thank
yeah.
you, Maisha. It's such a pleasure being in conversation with you, and I really appreciate your wisdom and for holding
Mm.
this space and inviting me in.
Oh, thank you so much, Amber, for being with me today, for bringing your wisdom and your knowledge, and for being a partner, a sister warrior in this work with me, being in community with me. I just really, really appreciate the work that you do and who you are and what you stand for. And I look forward to keeping our connection and to more conversations.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yes. And to our listeners, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for those who continue to share these episodes with their friends, their family members, with their colleagues and the leaders in their life and their communities. Because when you do, we expand this conversation, we expand this knowledge, we expand these practices, and we heal one another. I really appreciate those who leave comments, because the comments actually, they not only do they help others who come behind know that these conversations are of value, but they also help us to help the algorithms. They help the algorithms and the platforms to serve up so that more people can get these conversations. So please share and subscribe and do all of the things that we always ask you to do on this podcast, so that we can continue to ripple out these transformations. All right. So, Amber, there's one question that I don't want to forget to ask, and that is, if people want to find you, they want to dive in and read all the works and read about the Trust Compass, and invite you to speak or to consult, where can they do that?
Thank you for asking. They can find me at the Center for Trust and Transformation, www.centerfortrustandtransformation.com. I have a new venture, trustcompass.studio, so go check it out. It'll be launching soon. I'm on Substack and LinkedIn, so you can find me in whichever place speaks to you.
Yes, we promise to have all of these links in the show notes so that you can keep up with and follow Dr. Amber Banks. And you will also hear her back on this podcast. So stay tuned. I'll let you know. I'll let you know what's coming up in the 2026.
People get ready.
That's right. That's right, boy. It's getting deep. Well, you all, as you go about your week, continue to reflect on today's conversation, pass it along, and until the next time we see you, stay empowered.